Hi, this is Joel Peckham here, and today we're going to be talking with Darius Atefat Peckham, my son, to talk about the poetry form of the Ghazal. You all have the option of writing a Ghazal this week, and I thought it might be really interesting to talk to someone who's writing in the form, who's fairly proficient in it, who can talk not only about what the rules are, but also what the challenges are in composing the Ghazal, what the attraction to the form is, and what are the opportunities it gives us as poets that are inherent to the form. Um, Darius, besides being my son, is a very accomplished poet, and I'm actually going to read his bio here. Darius Atefat Peckham is the author of the chapbook How Many Love Poems from Seven Kitchens Press in 2021, is also the editor of his mother, Susan Atefat Peckham's posthumous collection, Deep Are These Distances Between Us, from Carry Press in 2023. And he is the winner of this year's Autumn House Poetry Prize, and his collection of poems, A Book of Kin, will be forthcoming from that press in the fall of 2024. His work has recently appeared in Poetry Magazine, Poem a Day, Shenandoah, Rattle, The Journal, The Georgia Review, and he also has poems forthcoming in the Kenyon Review. Atefat Peckham grew up right here in Huntington, West Virginia, and is currently working on his MFA in the Michener program from the University of Texas at Austin. So Darius, there you go. That's the most formal
Hi.
introduction I've ever given you to anybody
Hello,
else.
Dr.
Normally I just
Peckham.
go, this is my kid.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so what I've asked
inviting
Darius
me,
to
Dr.
do, and I'm
Peckham.
going to hand this over to him a little bit, is to actually read one of his ghazals. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but I'm doing the best I can. And then to talk to us about what brought him to the form, and also kind of what are the conventions and what are the challenges of composing in this form. So
Mhm.
Darius, it's all yours.
Yeah, okay. So I will share my screen. Thanks so much, Dad. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this because it is one of my favorite forms. I was made aware of it by a lot of contemporary poets who are working in it. And then sort of worked my way back a little bit where I was like, where did this form come from? And like, what's the sort of tradition lineage of it? I think it's always interesting to sort of backtrack and do that kind of work. It was popularized in English by this poet, who's Agha Shahid Ali, who a lot of people really love. In this book, it's called "Call Me Ishmael Tonight," and I think it was posthumous actually, but a collection of all the ghazals that he wrote. He ended up dying of brain cancer very young, but he writes really beautifully. Um, a lot about sickness and the body and thinking about like I don't know how to reach out towards the divine and also be within a body that is dying. And, it's really, really powerful stuff. So I'd recommend that if people are interested in getting some, um, some background on when it came into the English language. Um, but initially it was an Arabic form and can be traced back to like 7th century Arabia, which is like really kind of amazing. And then it was popularized globally by Persian Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafez and some of these like household names that we think of now. So I'm gonna share my screen and show like I'm gonna kind of show a ghazal that I have in progress. And I'm thinking something that Agha Shahid Ali wrote in his introduction to an anthology of English language ghazals that he has um, collected really like inspired these ones. And what it was that, a ghazal can be like one couplet. So it can be a really short poem, but also theoretically, it could go on forever. And partly that's because what a ghazal is kind of like a collection. Each couplet is meant to be its own sort of poem and self-contained. So when we think of even like the stanza in free verse poetry, like each line is saying its own thing. Each stanza is sort of saying its own thing. And then, the whole poem has this overall like tone and message. But in the Ghazal, it's taking that to like the furthest extreme, where it's like you literally have all these little like it's almost like anthologizing stanzas or something. And it gives you all this freedom because you can start again, you can end anywhere. You can go from like, you wanted to have some associative movement, but it really expands the bounds of like where a poem can go, I think. Um, and that was really exciting and freeing for me. So I'll read this one after now that I've rambled a little bit. Um, but it's called After a Time, Rain. And I'm writing. So one thing that's interesting about these was that I was writing this longer sequence, and they move. So if you see like the last word that I chose here was mouth, and then that goes to her mouth, and then rain, and then to refrain, and then you have rain here. So that leads me to the next line. So that's kind of the movement that I'm making. Also important is that the way that a ghazal is constructed is you have the final word of the second line in every couplet has to be the same. It's a refrain. And then the preceding word should be some kind of rhyme. So here you can see that I'm rhyming devouring, cowering, right? Towers. And then you have rain as the final line of each couplet. And the reason for that, well, let me read it and then I'll tell you the reason for it. Okay. After a time, rain. You appear to me a long while, stepping out from the shower like rain. Your chest blooms cold, my eyes, small hands devouring the rain. In what body does time stand? Star dunes, oceans of snow. Your hands tease out the million bodies within my body, an ocean cowering in rain. In security, hands pat me down like earth. They search, turning over the earth, the thunder that precedes the rain. After the towers, bodies, after a time, rain. The poet king gauges the use of his name, how it falls, how he's fallen into how many soothsaying mouths, how many eyes see sowing his rain. What the Shah can't afford, a bed in that house of stalactite, gemstone mirrors. His sleep is expensive and bright, caught in arrows of rain. What do I want from you? For you, how do I wish, want into you, into lineage, into myth, into mouth, into rain? What can I ask of the flowering rain? To achieve my brother's death through that windshield as flight, to reproduce it in another boy's body, his mouth open, alive and opened, overflowing with rain. Your step moves closer, infinitesimally, achingly minute minute of grief. Tell me what beauty is. A breaking into what? Into sorrow? Rain? I'm away from you again, the sky looking like rain, driving me back in a roof-down convertible, the post-happy hour clouds soaked with rain. A friend describes the plot of Fly Away Home. I tell her how confidently my grief functions. She's patient to my trying. I love her how I love the listening rain. I feel the distance in me ache like bone. I'm safe. I reach for you, listening into the silent after of the bowering rain. Okay. I think maybe my internet was a little unstable during that.
Yeah, it froze
Unfortunately.
up a little in the last couple of lines.
Oh shoot.
Pick
I can
up.
read the last lines again.
Yeah,
I feel
start
the dis
from a friend describes.
Okay. A friend describes the plot of Fly Away Home. I tell her how confidently my grief functions. She's patient to my trying. I love her how I love the listening rain. I feel the distance in me ache like bones in rain. Darius, when will you see them? After this, I promise, your foot making in the mat like snow, after snow, like time softening, your voice calling sleeplessly my name. Tell me I'm safe. I reach for you, listening into the silent after of the bowering rain. Oh, I'm glad I got to read that again because I didn't think I read it as well the first time.
All right.
But I think one thing that the form really affords you is a kind of like hypnotic, like, like musical quality. There's kind of like this, something Ross Gay talks about, which is like music as the engine for meaning making, and like music in a line allowing you to really like sink into um a kind of atmospheric meaning rather than like really like professing something and saying something, like or thinking that you're saying something. But anyway, I really like that about the Ghazal, and I think there are a lot of like fun things that you can do formally. So you can start playing with the form in a way, one thing that's important to remember is that since this is not an English language form, every ghazal in English is going to be somewhat broken. Um, so you have some room to play around, I think. But so you see moments like where I was realizing this line was getting too long, and I was thinking like how to play with the idea of like overflowing with rain or like a a body of water kind of overflowing. So if you move with rain down to the next line, you have this feeling of like breathlessness, this feeling of like you can't, if each couplet's supposed to be so contained, where in the poem is this like this moment of like heightened emotion in which the form can't like contain, that feeling. And potentially you can do something like this, which is like overflowing with rain. Or when you really want to slow down, you can transform rain into something else. So here it's like I transform rain into snow. And that's because I wanted to, get to another point in the cycle of water that feels a little bit slower, more beautiful, like that in a way that like slows down time, and allows you to really be present in that moment. Um, so I think that that's what I kind of mean, where like, the sonic quality of this like hypnotic rhythm that starts to happen, can help you realize like, okay, what am I doing with pacing here? What am I doing with rhythm? What am I doing? Like, how does that relate to content? How does the music relate to content? And that's what formal poetry can really afford a poet, is like kind of playing around with that idea. Um, yeah, I don't know. And then I think this is a fun one to bring up because, you have the poet, the speaker, sort of in this intimate moment with their beloved. And then you can, in a ghazal, like this leap can happen, and it can happen in another poem too, but here we get to like really move somewhere else. Like it's like, so there were hands before. Now the hands have transformed into new hands, that are more it helps both like think about the intimacy of being in like security at the airport, and like when somebody's patting you down, there's a kind of feeling like, oh, I'm being touched by another person. But like, what does that touch mean? How does that touch differ? How does touch for the speaker transform, because of all the touch that they've had previously? You know, what does it mean to be touched lovingly when you've been touched in a way that's like suspicious? So there are things that I don't know. The Ghazal affords a kind of a poet speaker to do. You can jump into the past like this. This stanza is all happening in like the 18th century. Which is kind of cool. But it's still like very much like thinking about how do we sleep, like what you know when we have all these anxieties, what does it feel like? What does it feel like to sleep when you have responsibility? Um, you know, and you're not, for whatever reason, being responsible. And so I think like sort of humanizes history in a way, brings it to the present. Um,
It really
yeah,
forces that kind of leaping, doesn't it?
yeah,
that you, because these couplets need to be contained, and
Right.
you know, conceptually you should be able to move them around almost anywhere in the poem and the poem still works.
Right.
um, and but one thing I noticed that's very traditional in a ghazal that you do at the end of the poem is
Hmm.
that line where you say, Darius, when will you see?
Yeah.
That movement where the poet addresses the self.
Right.
You don't do that in every ghazal, but I see you doing it here.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of one of the conventions, right?
Right. That's one of the conventions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're supposed to name or rename the self. It can get really interesting because, you know, just like any poem, when you make that apostrophe towards the self, it could be to a persona as well. So a lot of poets will rename themselves in ghazals. Dwayne Reginald Betts does this in his ghazals, where he's thinking about like who he is before being an incarcerated person in America and then who he was after that experience, and really like trying to shape and transform like his being really in poetry, which is really powerful. I guess Shahid Ali does it like this line, "Call me Ishmael tonight." Like he renames himself Ishmael in one poem. So it can also be a type of persona. And that's what I think is also really interesting with the Ghazal is that these couplets, like one couplet could be a persona poem, and then the other I in another couplet could be the Shah of Iran. And then the other I could just be really the poet's self. So it's interesting, like here in my poem, when you use that apostrophe and you address the self, it turns into a you, right? It necessitates that change. And that changes perspective, like it kind of lifts you up, um, changes tone. So I love that move in the ghazal always. Like I'm always so interested in how that changes things. Um,
What does it mean to write from yourself, and then what does it mean to write to yourself?
yeah, yeah.
That kind of turning around, it almost forces you, you move from the subjective to, it's not objective really. I'm not sure objectivity is really a thing, but like, but that movement to actually where you're forced to look at yourself and your own experience and come
Right.
to some realizations based on that. It's a powerful move.
Yeah.
Um, Also, there's a quality of uh, ghazals are often dealing with issues of love, of
Hmm.
of being addressed or being about the distance between you and the beloved, whoever the beloved might be.
Right.
I see you making gestures towards that in this poem too.
Yeah. On its like very base level, it's a poem about being in a long distance relationship, like young, in life. And that's really interesting because obviously it gets into all these other things about being Iranian American, and living in America and like how to navigate that. It gets into being a person who's lost people, the part about the brother. Um, you know, and I think that that's really interesting too, like where does this, having this final word, like even I was mostly like I wanted the Shaw line, I really wanted to play with the word rain,
Yeah.
here. And thinking about my name, which is my namesake is King Darius, having that be like an element of these poems where like what does it mean for me to come from like kings, right? So that's important too. So you can play with like rhyme too. Like Aga Shahid Ali has all these poems that like he doesn't even choose a final word, they just all rhyme, right? So I could have done this, like I could have done rain, grain, train, lane, like you can do that too. Which is cool. Um,
So you actually sort of very intentionally are making choices that are playing with the form. Um, One of the things that the first time well, you showed me a bunch of guzzles and said I wrote a guzzle to you, and so you know, but approaching it, I was like, oh my goodness, this form is brutal. Like it's got all of I've got to have the repeat word and then the rhyming word before the repeat word, and then all of these couplets need to be able to stand on their own and be moved anywhere in the poem, and then I'm supposed to address myself at the end, and I didn't come near doing all of that. What would you say to a poet who's coming to the form and is like, oh God, this is really daunting. This is hard. What
Yeah.
would you say to them?
I would just say approach it with um for me, so honestly, for me, one of the reasons why I really wanted to work in this form was because I actually was having a hard time writing poems in free verse, which is like seems ironic or something. Like it should be the other way around, like free verse should be more freeing or whatever. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think like trying, in free verse, you have to try to find an internal rhythm and form. And I think that's really hard. But what's nice about the Ghazal is it gave me direction. It gave me a form to work in. But then I think, all these conventions of the form are just that, they're conventions and their tradition. And that's something that you can really, I think it is beautiful to respect that, but I also think there's something to be said about playing with like the elasticity of the form. For me, like I was playing with and against the form. So there are lines like, yes, like you said, a ghazal is supposed to be able to like you can move any couplet anywhere. And a lot of these couplets you could do that with, but some of them you can't. So one of the things that like for me like was really interesting is like where in the poem do I want to constrict the forms like constriction. Like what how do I want to act like a form to this form? I don't know if that makes sense. But I'm like I think that it makes you like I'm constantly thinking about how do you update a form? How do you push it forward? Because otherwise I don't really know like what's new or like what I don't know. Like if you're just working within form and not like it can be really wonderful to do that. But also we want to think about like how to make it relevant to like today. Like think about the American sonnets with Terence Hayes. They follow like a pretty like a stricter-ish formal quality, but they also like the content is what's kind of pushing them forward. So you can do it in form or content or both. Um, this is a lot, but I think that for me, it was like where are the moments in which the form doesn't get to dictate like how the poem moves? Where do I exhibit that control or exert that control and force? So like moments like this where it's like um I'm away from you again, the sky looking like rain, driving me back in roof down convertible, the post-happy hour clouds soaked with rain. A friend describes the plot of Fly Away Home. Like there's no way that you can take those and like jumble them around because it's not going to work. They still work on like a couplet level as their own kind of things, but not like those two kind of have to be right next to each other in that order. Um,
It's
so
hard to do in gym and allow them to move around. I discovered
right, exactly. It's almost impossible. You can, but
it's
it's
hard.
difficult. Um,
So why don't we
yeah.
take this down, if you don't mind?
Yes. Okay.
Darius has control right now, which of course, giving up control is a difficulty for me.
Yeah.
Um, but
That's
you've
personal.
mentioned a few other authors that you've read.
Mhm.
Um, could you go through like like some other authors that you think that students who are interested in the Guzzle form might take a look at, or even rename them for us so that they're in
Yeah.
your minds as they move forward?
So, Agha Shahid Ali is really an amazing one. Probably the master of ghazals. So also the pronunciation of that it can be like ghazals if you're thinking more in Arabic, but then it can be like in Persian it's ghazal. In English we often do ghazal. This is fine as well. Um, so I was thinking Agha Shahid Ali is amazing. Kazim Ali is amazing, and oftentimes is writing directly after Agha Shahid Ali, which I think is interesting. Um, actually, there are some amazing poets you know, without like Indian or Middle Eastern background who write amazing ghazals. So W.S. Merwin has a bunch of them that are really great. And I would recommend. Who is this? Uh, Let me go get this book. But this author I'm just reading recently. This is like brand new, but Hala Alian. She has some really good ones. There's one called Habibi Ghazal that was in the New Yorker that I really love and I shared with you. Um, oh, who else? Um,
Smith has the hip hop Guzzle.
oh yeah, Patricia Smith, right? Um, I think Kaveh Akbar has a bunch in his in Pilgrim Bell, or maybe one or two. Oh, I just read a couple that are amazing by an Iranian poet who's named Armen Davoudian. And he has a book called The Palace of 40 Pillars. And there are two ghazals in there that I think are two of the best ones I've read in a long while. So he's really great too. And he's great with the sonnets as well. The long sequence in that book is a sequence of 20 sonnets that are about Isfahan, where he grew up, which yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are some. There are a lot. I think a lot of Tarfia Faizullah is really good. She has one about mangoes. That's really pretty amazing. And that's a broken puzzle. So those are also good to remember is that you can enjam on the last word. So if it's like you're choosing, I've done mother before. You can enjam on mother so that like the line continues, and that's called a broken puzzle. It's not a strict one. Um, yeah, so
So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I gotta wrap this up because I
yeah,
have to move on to the rest of my day. I'd love to talk poems with my son all day.
I'm really
But thank you so much, Darius. And I keep having to reminding myself not to call you Bear. So but look for his collection that'll be coming out in the fall. Book of Kin from Autumn House Press, and enjoy writing your own guzzles because I cannot pronounce it the way that Darius does. And thank you so much, Darius, who's zooming in for me all the way from Texas today, and it is much appreciated. So thank you.
Thanks, Dad.
All
I'm
right.